Over 5,000 years ago, in the Boyne Valley in Ireland, a remarkable Neolithic society constructed a complex of grand monuments in this beautiful, sacred landscape. The most famous and most impressive of them all is known as Newgrange. Built in around 3200 BC, it is older than the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge in England. The Great Mound is an enormous 85 metres or 280 feet across, and reaching 12 metres or 40 feet high. Inside the mound, a stone-lined passageway 19 metres or 60 feet long leads to a chamber with a corbelled roof. Off the central chamber there are 3 niches. On stones within the chamber and passage, and on the many curbstones circling the mound, these people carved an array of enigmatic art. These kinds of monuments are called passage graves, and human remains were placed inside. And new ancient DNA analysis has revealed the society that built these great tombs may have been ruled over by an aristocratic elite, perhaps even by sacred and powerful god-kings, whose remains were then interred in these dark chambers for eternity. But they were much more than just tombs. This vast structure was precisely built so that one morning every year, the light of the midwinter sunrise shone directly through a special window and illuminated the inner chamber, signalling the rebirth of the year. But who built this astonishing monument? Where did they come from, and how did they live? What can we learn from the other megalithic structures nearby and throughout Ireland and Britain? And what can ancient DNA analysis reveal about the builders of this monument and the great mysteries of Neolithic Ireland? This is the astounding story of the National Monument of Ireland and the mysterious people who built it, the God-Kings of Newgrange. The ancient site of Newgrange is in County Meath in Ireland, and that's where some of my ancestors are from and where some of my relatives still live today. I love exploring my own family history and ancestry, and that's why on this video I've partnered with MyHeritage. For a limited time, you can now get your own DNA kit for the incredibly low price of $29, euros or pounds, depending on where you live, using my link and code. You might remember I previously partnered with MyHeritage and shared the results of my DNA test, but they recently created a new algorithm for the ethnicity estimate, which is now updated to version 2.5. They've added new ethnicities and reference panels. Mine is still mostly Britain and Ireland, but there's a more detailed breakdown between Scottish, Welsh, Irish and Breton, for example. But to me, one of the most exciting new features they've introduced is called Ancient Origins, and it's filled with the stuff that I talk about on this channel, but it's tailored to my own DNA. When you're analysing someone's DNA for their ancestral components, there's loads of different ways you can slice it. For example, comparing it to specific ancient reference populations from various eras, like this Ancient Origins breakdown one for the Bronze Age era. Divided between these two reference populations, I'm 59% Neolithic farmer and 41% Western steppe herder. And you can get breakdowns for different eras. Another analysis compares different, even more ancient West Eurasian reference populations. So I can see that I'm 41% European hunter-gatherer, divided between Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers. Another kind of analysis looks at how closely your DNA matches with specific ancient groups, or in 2 or 3-way splits between them, and there's so many variations to explore. It's fantastic to see how closely my DNA fits with all these ancient societies that I've made videos on, including the megalithic culture that this video is about. There are even more features that I don't have time to show you, but all this is a really exciting opportunity to engage with our ancient past in a unique and individualised way. If you think you'd be interested in finding out your own ancient origins, then click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on screen and use the coupon code DAN29 to get your DNA testing kit for the incredibly low price of $29. Thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring the video. Newgrange is in a region called Bóinne in County Meath in Ireland. The name of the monument might be confusing, but it's a relatively modern one, named after a nearby farm. Bóinne means something like the mansion or palace of the Bóinne, and the Bóinne is the name of the river that flows around this complex, which is also known as the Bend of the Bóinne. There are actually 37 tombs here, including 2 more enormous monuments very similar to Newgrange called Knowth and Dowth. Knowth especially is also absolutely magnificent and is bursting with incredible artwork. We'll talk more about that later. The story of Newgrange actually starts long before it was built. The first Neolithic farmers to settle permanently in Ireland arrived in the centuries after about 4000 BC. They likely paddled their boats, along with their seeds and young livestock, over from Brittany. Various groups, over a few generations, likely made their way up the Irish Sea and along the coasts. These journeys likely happened around the same time, or maybe a little later, as similar colonists were making their way into Britain from further east along the northern coast of continental Europe. One of the ways we know where these colonists came from is because of the kinds of structures they built. They erected megalithic tombs along the coasts of the Irish Sea that are similar to earlier ones from northwest France. In the first few centuries of the Neolithic here, these colonists carved out new landscapes, felling trees by burning and with their stone axes, creating pasture for animals, and turning over the soil to plant their crops. A way for these many family groups or clans of claiming ownership over their new lands was to erect megalithic monuments of various kinds. These monuments, made from stone, were a permanent imposition on the landscape that declared, "This place is ours, and we descend from these founders, our ancestors." The various groups colonising Britain and Ireland developed regional identities over the first few generations. These identities are seen in diverging regional pottery styles and in regional megalithic tomb types as well. These tombs usually had one or more chambers inside and could be enclosed by more stones or earth, but the specific form, size and functions were different in different places and in different times. Most people in these societies never had their remains placed in tombs. Instead, on death, they were likely exposed to the elements and to wild animals, or placed in rivers or the sea, or were cremated and the ashes scattered. So the people who had some or all of their bones placed into tombs were special or notable in some way. You would expect them to be honoured ancestors, perhaps the founders of the local lineage who had carved out their particular place in the world. Erecting the tombs were a way of expressing that ownership of the land, honouring the founders of the lineages that had led their families in making these dangerous voyages, and special people responsible for turning a wild frontier into a new homeland through enormous toil and strong leadership. This is supported by ancient DNA evidence, showing genetic relationships between individuals buried within a specific tomb, or between individuals at different sites of the same tomb type. It seems like the first colonists, once they had established themselves, built portal tombs and court cairn type monuments. The rectilinear shapes of some of these tombs could reflect the shapes of the houses of the early Neolithic. Perhaps they were thought of as eternal houses of the dead, where the ancestors could reside for eternity. And passage tombs are a type with a stone chamber beneath a round mound, which is accessed by a passage. They are found across the Atlantic coast from Iberia to Orkney, even to Scandinavia, and Ireland has over 220 of them, dating roughly to between 3600 and 2900 BC. Most of them occur within 4 clusters or complexes, 2 in County Meath, the Boyne Valley and Lough Crew, and 2 in County Sligo, Carramore and Carrakiel. The timing of their construction reflects wider changes in Neolithic Ireland. Over those first few centuries of colonisation after 4000 BC, the landscapes of Britain and Ireland were steadily explored and exploited, and the population grew. But then by about 3600 BC, there was a downturn. The evidence suggests a population decline and the regrowth of woodlands across these islands. It's likely the climate became colder and farming was more difficult. People seem to have relied more on gathering wild foods, and especially on herding animals. It must have been a difficult time, and the people would have been aware that their lives were now harder than those of their recent ancestors. There were likely different responses to these challenges by different groups. Some would have done better than others. We must imagine that the leaders of these more successful societies, those able to come up with innovative social and economic solutions, those with the courage, strength and vision, would have been revered and celebrated. These leaders may have led their people out of this crisis while also accumulating more power and resources for them and their descendants. During this era, perhaps after about 3500 BC, passage tombs were constructed that had interior spaces large enough for people to enter along the passageway, and side chambers that were also large enough for a person to crouch in. Some of these larger, more complex tombs were clustered in special places on high ridges or highlands like at Carramore and Carrickeel. It might be that the leaders of these societies, along with ritual specialists, removed themselves from the everyday domestic world of houses and animals to perform rituals at these sites. And once the climate improved again, after about 3200 BC, the largest and most impressive passage tombs were constructed. The most important ritual centre was beside the river Boyne, where it curves around a sloping upland. This geography creates a kind of border around this area, delineating a sacred landscape separated from the ordinary world. And this was where they built at least 90 monuments, including the 3 great passage tombs of Knowth, Dowth and Newgrange. So what makes these monuments so special? Newgrange occupies a prominent central position in this sacred landscape, straddling the crest of a high ridge with commanding views across the valley below. The Knowth and Dowth tomb complexes are located just 1 to 2 kilometres away, each on their own ridges. The huge Newgrange tomb is a flat-topped mound around 12 metres or 40 feet high and about 85 metres or 280 feet in diameter. Around the base of the mound are 97 massive curbstones, many of which feature Neolithic carvings. The mound was reconstructed in the modern era, with this spectacular shining quartz and granite facade curving around the front. This interpretation has been challenged though, and it might be that these stones were used to create a ground surface in front of the monument instead, a spectacular platform perhaps, like a fabulous stage for communal ritual activities. There was also a stone circle erected around the monument, but whether the stones were placed in the Neolithic or the Bronze Age is also debated. In front of the entrance is a famous stone with some of the finest quality carvings. The passage itself is 19 metres long, which leads to a chamber with a corbelled roof. Off the central chamber there are 3 niches. The largest one is on the right hand side. Many Neolithic passage tombs have this emphasis on the right hand side. It seems to be where the most important niches were. This might reflect the layout of domestic houses, where the right-hand side was often larger and more important, or it might reflect a broader ideological emphasis on the right-hand side of physical spaces as a reflection of the procession of the sun across the sky. Above and set back a little way from the entrance of Newgrange, there is an opening they call the roof box. This structure allows the rays of the rising sun at the winter solstice to illuminate the passage and chamber. While the long passage, the roof box and this extent of the mound were likely constructed between 3200 and 3000 BC, it may have been extended to its current dimensions from an earlier, smaller passage tomb, and there might have been even earlier timber structures and turf mounds on this site. Anyway, the hypothetical extension of the passage, which slopes down at a different angle, might have required the innovation of the roof box to allow in the sun's rays on the morning of the winter solstice. It's likely this alignment linked the annual death and rebirth of the sun with the death and rebirth of the souls of the ancestors within the monument. Much has been made of the supposed astronomical alignments of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments in Britain and Ireland, but most of them aren't as obviously aligned as this one is, and the others that are don't tend to be quite so precise. Probably this precision was developed over generations, from the rough alignments at some of the early passage tombs to the more precise ones at Newgrange, Knowth, Dowth and Loch Rue that probably date to after 3200 BC. It likely took a lot of working out and adjustment to get it just right, but the effect it created was surely powerful. You can imagine the select few people inside taking part in the ritual, waiting in the darkness of the chamber for the sun to rise, the silvery pre-dawn light filtering through the entrance, until the thin beam of golden light pierced the darkness, gradually widening to flood the chamber with the power of the reborn sun. If it was a cloudy morning on any of these winter solstices, hardly a rare occurrence in rainy Ireland, the effect would have been greatly diminished. Perhaps this would have been seen as an ill omen for the year ahead and for the ruler in charge. Some researchers have suggested the growing emphasis on solar movements and the return of the sun can be linked to the climatic downturn. Perhaps those tribal leaders who developed the rituals that most successfully appeased the gods and ensured good seasons were the ones who accumulated increasing earthly power and influence over the surrounding communities. It seems likely these great rulers who built Newgrange would have been interred within. Unfortunately, the tomb was greatly disturbed over the millennia since, with the most interesting grave goods and likely the skulls and limb bones of the rulers removed as trophies and lost forever. Even so, various artefacts have been found in passage tombs in Ireland, including carved bone pins, stone balls, and the massive carved stone basins, which you could argue are more architectural features than artefacts. But one famous artefact I've shown before on my channel is the incredible flint mace head found at Knowth, which is clearly the work of a master craftsman. And thankfully, small bone fragments remained in Newgrange for archaeologists to discover in various excavations in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. These organic remains produced radiocarbon dates between about 3200 and 3000 BC, showing when most of the depositions took place. Fragments of burnt and unburnt human bone were most concentrated in the recesses on the left and right, mostly on the larger, more impressive recess on the right. And the remaining unburnt bone fragments represented just 2 adults. Recent DNA testing on one of these men, published in a paper in 2020, had quite startling results. Amazingly, it showed his parents were first-degree relatives, perhaps father and daughter, or more likely, brother and sister. Now this is a universal human taboo. This kind of thing was not practiced in the Neolithic any more than it is now. As the paper says, quote, "The only known definitive acceptances of such mating occur among siblings, specifically within polygynous elites, as part of a rarely observed phenomenon known as royal or dynastic incest. In all of these documented cases, for example, in pre-contact Hawaii, the Inca Empire and ancient Egypt, this behaviour co-occurs with the deification of political leaders and is typically limited to ruling families whose perceived divinity exempts them from social convention." End quote. I'd go further and say that based on wider ethnographic and historical studies, these kinds of practices didn't just exempt rulers from social convention. The inversion of cultural norms, doing the opposite of what was normal, had ritual power. It served to emphasise the social difference between the ruler and their subjects. Being a ruler in pre-modern societies wasn't just about telling everyone what to do while eating all the nice food. They were in a prominent and potentially dangerous position, both physically and metaphysically. They often had to mediate between this world and the next. They were the conduit between the people and the gods. They enforced the law, but were also bound by it. And their privileges came with responsibilities. While their successes could be rewarded, so their failures could be punished. There was often a wary distance kept between a ruler and their people, similar to how the sacred complexes were physically separated from the profane world. This could be expressed in the role of what have been called God-kings, rulers so sacred and separate that they were semi-deified on earth. And one way that separation could be maintained was through selective breeding within the aristocracy and even, in those societies with god-kings, within the royal family itself. And that seems to have happened with the rulers of Newgrange. And amazingly, there is evidence supporting this in Irish mythology. The Bóinne passage tombs appear in medieval mythology, where their construction is linked to magical manipulations of the solar cycle by a tribe of gods. The chief god, the Dagda, resides within Newgrange itself. He controls the weather and crops, as well as time and the seasons. And he owns a magic staff that kills with one end and brings to life with the other. He also owns a magical cauldron which never runs empty. It seems astonishing that oral tradition could have retained this information for 5,000 years. But traditional knowledge of real-world events has been accepted by anthropologists for other parts of the world for even longer timespans. And most convincingly of all, the Dowth passage tomb here is associated with a myth where the builder-king of the tomb restarts the solar cycle by copulating with his sister. And in fact, the Irish name for the Dowd Passage tomb can be translated as the Hill of Incest. So these monuments were tombs and houses for the dead, but they were much more than that. They were statements of ownership on the landscape, and they were spectacular declarations of power and authority, of legitimacy. And they were also sites for large public rituals. Earlier and smaller passage tombs seem to have been more restricted. They were in harder to reach locations, the artwork hidden away inside the chambers, and there was limited space for gatherings outside. But these large late sites included external public artwork and had spaces that might have facilitated huge gatherings outside of them. The rulers and ritual specialists might have stood in front of the tombs or even on their flat tops with a crowd of spectators in front. Rites could have taken place not just at midwinter but at other key times of the year. Attendees could have come in from across the wider region, and one or more of these events could have been like festivals involving feasting and music and dancing. Alliances and weddings could be arranged, disputes settled, and so on. These communities attending the rites were likely also involved in the construction of these monuments. They would have required trees to be felled and processed, scaffolding erected, ditches had to be dug, sites levelled, stones had to be quarried and transported, and so on. The workers would have required feeding and other logistical support. We don't know how many people worked on them or how long they took to build, but clearly they were enormous undertakings, Newgrange and Knowth especially. We get a sense of the territory that might have been controlled by the Newgrange builders in the locations of the stones used in its construction. The various kinds and colours of stone were brought in from up to 60 kilometres away. It's likely that the quarried and collected stones were transported by boat along the coasts and up the river. And the 2020 ancient DNA study found that burials in the tomb complexes in the northwest of the island were related to the lineage interred at Newgrange. This suggests they were part of a broader aristocracy, stretching back generations from the west to the east coast. At earlier, smaller dolmen sites in the southwest, a different lineage was detected, and at yet another type of tomb in the southeast of the island, a very rare male lineage was detected. These hints in ancient DNA, along with the typologies of tomb types in their material culture, suggest distinct regional and temporal subgroups within the overarching Irish Neolithic. And one of the most remarkable and influential expressions of identity is the incredible megalithic artwork of Newgrange. But what can this artwork tell us about these people, their worldview, and what secret, sacred activity might have happened here? The artwork in and around Newgrange and similar monuments varies in content and quality and location. The designs feature circles, spirals, zigzags and chevrons, lozenges and other shapes. Some carvings are sophisticated and were created with great care. Others are of lower quality and more haphazard. No one knows exactly what they're supposed to convey or why they were made. One suggestion is that they reflect something of the transcendental experiences of the ritual participants within the structures. It's possible that people retreated into the dark silence of these places, removed from the ordinary world, and sat in the darkness. Maybe one person sat in each niche, maybe others in the central chambers. Perhaps music and chanting and the consumption of mind-altering substances produced altered states of consciousness, resulting in visual hallucinations. The forms of visual geometric hallucinations people experience in a psychedelic state is related to how our visual processing works on a biological level, so we know that our ancestors under these conditions would have seen the same kinds of geometric shapes that we do today, those being lattices, cobwebs, tunnels and spirals. And everyone participating would have all seen similar things, or at least shared some elements of their visions. Maybe the people who experienced these visions carved them onto the stones during and especially after their experiences. These were surely visions of the spirit world, which was accessed through the monument itself. Or the monument was the underworld, and the chamber and niches were not dead ends but doorways. The spirals in the walls could have metaphysically led inward through the rock and earth into the place where the ancestors resided for eternity. Some of the carvings were likely made in place, and others were carved before the stones were laid, because they continue under the earth or are on the sides or backs of the stones that weren't accessible or even visible once in place. So some art was created to be seen, while other art was meant to be hidden. At least hidden from the view of the living. Maybe it was meant to be seen by the ancestors from the other side. It's thought some of the carved stones were reused from earlier monuments. Surfaces were also reused, with earlier art tapped out using a technique called pick dressing, and new art created on top. In other places, pick dressing was used to emphasize designs. In the earlier type of passage tombs, the artworks were limited to the hidden interior. At Newgrange, there was artwork outside too. This reflects the idea that these great passage tombs were designed to be more public and visible to greater numbers of attendees. Most of the artwork is geometric and perhaps symbolic, meant to represent other things or ideas. Maybe circles or spirals are supposed to be something to do with the sun or with journeying to the other world. Maybe the wavy lines are the River Bóinne or the sea or the River of Souls or something like that. And there could be representations of actual things that we haven't worked out yet. One of the most intriguing designs in a chamber in Knowth is of what seems to be a humpback whale expelling a waterspout. This species has been seen off the Atlantic coast and in the Irish Sea, including in the regions where the various stones were brought from. The headland where some of the stones for these monuments were brought from is one of the area's best whale watching locations. And a humpback has been sighted north of Rockabill Island, the origin of some of the Newgrange quartz. Whales must have been strange creatures to the Neolithic seafarers of the Atlantic coasts, the biggest creatures in existence, passing by at certain times of the year, perhaps beaching themselves on occasion, must have inspired awe and respect. There have been suggestions that whales are depicted in the artwork in passage tombs in coastal Brittany too, but it's hard to know exactly what they meant to the Neolithic people and why they're associated with death and the realm of the ancestors. Some have seen links between passage tombs here in Ireland but also in Brittany and elsewhere as relating to islands. The complexes can be islands in the landscape, even separated by water, and perhaps reflect mythic stories of their seafaring origins. But it's the shapes of the tombs that really intrigue me. In the early Neolithic in Ireland, between about 3750 and 3600 BC, these first generations of colonists built sturdy, timber-framed, rectangular houses. These show up in the archaeological record as rows of post holes and trenches. Colonist groups seem to have done a similar thing in Britain too, but there's not as much evidence as there is in Ireland. These domestic buildings likely housed family groups, the larger ones of perhaps a dozen or more people. Smaller than the largest longhouses in Scotland and southern England, but still substantial. But after about 3600 BC, they seemed to stop building these structures. Perhaps the climatic downturn made farming garden plots more unreliable, and people had to take up a more mobile way of life, moving between pastures with their animals, and living in smaller, less permanent structures. These were often oval or circular, maybe with earth or stone footings, but with a structure made from inward slanting poles or stakes. And they could have built houses using methods that don't leave much or any archaeological evidence, like turf or sod houses, and semi-mobile structures like yurts. Or maybe they kept building houses in places we haven't found yet. But it's interesting to me to think that the people who could construct such enormous and impressive monuments that have lasted 5,000 years may have lived in far more ephemeral houses. The circular and ovoid shapes of the homes might be reflected in the round shapes of the monument mounds, however. Maybe they were built as grand and permanent houses of the dead in the shape of the temporary houses of the living. And after around 3000 BC, new ritual monuments, timber circles, started to appear across Ireland, some in proximity to circular timber houses. The new circularity of monuments would soon be taken up by groups in Orkney, the islands off the north coast of Scotland. It seems the power and prestige of Newgrange and Knowth influenced the elites there 600 kilometres away. They built solar-aligned passage tombs like Maes Howe and developed innovative monuments like stone circles, and it's around this time that henges also appear. The Irish passage tomb artwork also spreads to Orkney and perhaps to open-air rock art sites across the Irish Sea in northern Britain. And after 3000 BC, a new set of religious beliefs spread across Britain and Ireland related to the use of a new kind of pottery originating from Orkney, known as grooved ware, and involving feasting activity at new ritual sites. There had been a trend from small-scale rites in and around monuments to larger, more public activities. This trend perhaps continues with stone and timber circles and henges opening up ritual activity even further, with participants able to look in from outside and look out at the landscape from within. Exactly how the influence spread from Ireland to Britain isn't known. Some people believe elites in different places maintained political and trade relationships between the various power centres, those in Orkney adopting and adapting beliefs and practices and art styles from Eastern Ireland. Perhaps there was an element of pilgrimage in all these movements too. And it's plausible that some people moved from Ireland into northern Britain, especially considering that intensity of use at the sites here in the Boyne Valley declines in the late Neolithic. The new religious practices related to grooveware spread to Ireland and across Great Britain, and new smaller monuments are built. But there's less activity in and around the great monuments. This could be due to population decline, and maybe some groups left the area, or maybe because people practiced new kinds of rituals. The area was still attractive and special, even after the huge migration of the Bell-Beaker people after about 2500 BC. It's interesting that despite the enormous level of population replacement, there was still some degree of cultural continuity. Certainly, the great sacred sites attracted continuing interest, and at Newgrange, large timber circles were erected for ongoing ritual activity. But it eventually, by the Iron Age at least, fell out of use, and the great mounds slowly settled into the landscape and remained that way for thousands of years. But Newgrange must have retained some of its power and continued to draw interest, because, for example, in the early 4th century AD, someone deposited beautiful Roman gold jewellery here. And as we've said, the memory of the place, its rulers, and even its function was retained in part in the folklore and mythology of the Irish people for thousands of years. And thanks also to the work of archaeologists and other researchers in recent decades in uncovering and telling its story, it remains a source of immense pride for the Irish people today, and, I hope, for thousands of years to come. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. If you want to find out about your recent ancestry and support my channel at the same time, be sure to hit the link in the description or scan the QR code and use my coupon code DAN29 to get your DNA kit for this limited time deal. Thank you very much to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Now, please watch this video on the mysterious Folkestone drums and what they can tell us about beliefs and society in late Neolithic Britain. Thank you for watching.